an actual sociopath I worked with during my time as a social worker. I'm not much of a writer, but this is the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I've wanted to get it off my chest beyond what my co-workers know. And yes, this is actually a true story. Obviously a lot of the specifics have been altered for confidentiality, but the story itself is true and one I've wanted to write for a long time. I am a social worker, I have been for 5 years, and I've seen a lot in my line of work. But absolutely nothing compares to this one case. In college I got my degree in psychology and specialized in psychological trauma. I worked my way through until I was a full social worker working with kids 8 to 18. Many of my cases were not kids with trauma, but I was always assigned the most challenging cases due to my education, and psychological trauma is one of the most difficult types of mental health issues to work with effectively. I'm explaining this because despite all of my education and experience, I could never identify anything remotely connected to any sort of trauma to explain this 13-year-old boy's behavior. Background of the case. I was referred by a school counselor for general misbehavior and opposition in class. He was never violent or aggressive to staff or peers, but he constantly tested boundaries and made people uncomfortable. He had constantly shifting friends, and often his former friends reported he was very charming at first, but would eventually become more and more uncomfortable and manipulative. By the time he was referred, he was a bit of a loner, and had only one identifiable friend. His school counselor suspected abuse at home because this type of behavior is very typical for traumatized and abused kids. This is why I was assigned. The first day of the case I called the family beforehand, as I always do, and complete a general safety assessment to understand any potential risks I'm walking into it. As you can imagine, going into households is always a risk in this line of work. The family seemed very normal over the phone. No weapons in the house, a safe neighborhood, family were courteous and polite. All very good signs. I submitted my assessment practically blank due to how normal they seemed. Their house was impressive. Not a mansion, but definitely upper middle class. Father was a lawyer and worked out of a home office, and thankfully had plenty of time for his family. Mom was unemployed at the time but was a former educational specialist before staying at home full-time. Both parents were very supportive, very open, and easy to work with. Trust me, you have no idea how difficult most parents can be. At first I met my client's 2 younger siblings. Let's call them Mark and James. Both of them were very bright for their age and easy to talk to. They didn't seem to have anything notably wrong with them, however I had just some general feeling that there was something they weren't telling me. Something that they were hiding from even their parents. It's something I honestly believe the parents didn't notice, but after my years of experience it was a gut reaction I felt. Lastly, I met him, my client. Let's call him Chris. Chris was noticeably different from the family. He didn't smile when I first met him, he was pleasant enough to talk to, but he just felt off. Like the type of feeling you get when you meet someone and just feel uncomfortable but can't pinpoint a reason. After talking to all of them, it was clear that there was no significant source of serious stress or trauma in the family. Positive community supports, attentive parents, lovely family, stable income, everything a family could want. His parents did not see any serious trouble with Chris. They said he had some executive functioning problems, got frustrated quickly with stuff, and had typical teenager behavior by pushing boundaries and being oppositional. They were more than willing to accept help, but believed the school was overreacting. The next session I had was one-on-one Chris. That session will always stick out to me. It was noticeably uncomfortable. He would constantly pry for information about my personal life, which was very typical for my clients, but in this case it just felt like it was more than curiosity. He was fishing for information, like specific information. He wanted to learn about me like he was plotting something. I'm extremely good with boundaries, so it wasn't hard to deflect his questions and catch on to his clever games for him trying to trick me to give away more of my personal life. He got very frustrated with me because he could see I wasn't someone he could play around him. I fully expected him to say he never wanted to see me again, but surprisingly at the end of our session he said, "I had fun today, I'm looking forward to seeing you again." Those words chilled my heart. It was just the way he said it, I can't fully explain it, but it was one of the first times in my job where I truly felt nervous. Months go by and things start to become more clear at home. The parents confessed that things were worse than they were willing to admit. Chris totally ran the house, and they were too scared to admit to themselves they've lost control. Dad actually had been burying himself in work, locking himself in his room, and only coming out to binge on family activity when he felt comfortable. Mom was actually a nervous wreck, but was very good at hiding it. She spent the most one-on-one time with Chris and the family, and out of everyone was the one to work with him the best. Still, you could tell it was wearing down on her. His brothers, however, they avoided him at all costs. They never said why, and always provided reasonable excuses for avoiding him, but you could tell something was wrong. Chris began to get progressively more open and honest in session. Always tested my boundaries, but at least was able to explain his feelings and thoughts. As I worked more and more with him, I could tell he truly had no empathy for those around him. He wished that people would just listen to him, and felt sad that no one can put up with him. But really it was because people would get driven away once he tried to control them and manipulate them into doing what he wanted. Despite being an impenetrable wall to him, Chris really liked me. Definitely saw me as a challenge, but also I became the one person who he could open up to. Because of this, I felt confident that I could make a difference with him. He listened to me, and it sounded like he took my advice to heart. Still, every session he would end it by saying in a baby voice, "Make sure you're a good boy until I see you next, okay?" I always minimized it by treating it like a joke. But still, I fully recognize it as a warning sign. Unfortunately, it was only the first warning sign. One day we were talking about pets and animals, and the use of them as coping skills. His parents were debating getting a pet, and I thought it was a good opportunity to learn how to build coping skills with them. Chris said he really liked dogs, and really wanted one. He expressed how he really craves that unconditional love. And I thought this was all great. It wasn't until I learned that his idea of unconditional love was a being that would obey him utterly. I tested this by talking to him about having a cat, a pet definitely less inclined to taking orders. His response was chilling. He said that he hated cats, they annoyed him. He said the neighbors had a cat that stayed outside and he hated it. In fact, he actually said that one day he kicked it because it was bothering him too much. I asked what happened to the cat, and he said that it thankfully ran away. I knew this was bad. Remorselessly hurting animals is a big sign of serious problems. I turned this case into a high-priority case for my office afterwards, and we kept very close eye on it. Still, despite doing this, there was something I and my whole team clearly couldn't see. We knew it was there, but we couldn't see it. Things got slowly worse at home, especially during the approaching winter. I now had a family specialist working on the case, helping with behavioral interventions, and frankly, with help just living with Chris and his ability to control the house. I still worked one-on-one with Chris. One day I came over and he was building a snow fort. A very elaborate one with multiple rooms. It was honestly impressive. He played games with his siblings and one friend. One of which was some cops and robbers game. He even made a mini prison room for. I went into this prison room and I noticed bones embedded in the snow. At first I was curious, but not even shocked or worried. A lot of 13-year-olds are curious about animal bones, and it's not developmentally abnormal. Still, probably not appropriate for a jail. I asked him about it and he said it was from a squirrel that must have died right before the winter. This is something entirely possible. They had a forest in their backyard, and it wasn't the first dead squirrel they found. I asked him to toss out the bones out of respect for his siblings playing the game. And he agreed and pulled them out. As he took them out I saw the animal's skull. It wasn't a squirrel skull. I confronted him and said that this wasn't a squirrel skull. It looked like a cat's skull. His face went blank and he challenged me. He said that I didn't know what I was talking about and that it was a squirrel skull. I pressed more, and he eventually cut me off and said, "I don't want to talk about this, I'm removing the bones, what more do you want from me?" I was scared. That was definitely a cat skull, and if I had to bet, I bet I knew exactly which cat. A few months more went by and I did everything for this family. It started taking more of a toll on me now, and I didn't even realize it at first. I had nightmares and his words would echo in my head. But I didn't want to give up. I worked on cases that would also chill your soul to hear about, yet it was this case that kept me up at night. We went through 3 different family specialists during this time who would all leave for various reasons. But honestly I could tell, they didn't want to work with this family anymore. They knew something else was wrong, but couldn't tell what. It scared them. I don't blame them for leaving. But I didn't give up. I wanted to find some solution for them. I wanted these nightmares to stop. But most of all, I wanted to know that missing link. What was going on that I knew was happening? Something that I couldn't figure out. Eventually it came to light. I got a phone call at 9 p.m. one night that I'll remember for the rest of my life. "We need you to come over right now," the father said. We discovered something. My heart went cold and I went over immediately. The family was grim. Chris himself looked scared, and this was something I never saw before. It took a lot of prying, but the truth came to light. During bedtime, the father walked up and noticed the door cracked. He opened the door just to check in and saw something that finally solved the situation. The father walked in on Chris sexually abusing one of his younger brothers. They didn't get into specifics, and I didn't want them to. Hearing that made me feel sick. How long has this been going on? How did I not notice the signs? I've worked with dozens of sexually abused kids and I knew the signs. Yet I completely missed this. I told them I had to step out to make a phone call. But really it was because I was ready to throw up. I came back and checked in with both siblings. The other sibling, James, insisted he had no idea and that this wasn't happening to him. But I knew this wasn't true. Mark was quiet mostly. It was obvious that this was something that has gone on for a long time, but he had very little to say about it. The only thing he told me was that he wanted it, that he asked Chris for this. Hearing this only made me more sick. Then there was Chris himself. This was the first time he had no excuses and no lies. He begged for forgiveness and finally fully admitted to being sick and needing help. It was obvious what my next move was. I called Child Protective Services. The next day I was waiting to hear about how one or more of the children were removed for their own safety, yet when I came back I was shocked. Everyone was. They closed the case. They told me straight to my face that it was a misunderstanding and that sexual behavior between siblings at their age is not extremely uncommon and not indicative of abuse. This is true to a degree. In this case it was crystal clear. What happened while I was gone? What did they say? I fully suspected Chris to minimize it. But in order for this worker to not open the case they all had to minimize it. I asked the family afterwards what happened, and they told me they were just as surprised as I was. It was clear they weren't. I was worried how this would affect Chris's ego. I'm sure you can imagine that something like this would make him cocky and feel invincible. Yet it didn't. Chris was cautious and worried. He was on edge, and he knew that he fucked up. Yet I don't fully believe he saw what he did as wrong. The following months I struggled. The nightmares got worse and I had trouble working with the family. Clinically I should have switched with a coworker, and it was a mistake to not transfer the case. I just didn't want to give up. I needed to do something more than ever. The family was in shambles. The months following were worse than ever. Chris was actually much more behaved. He was different. More nervous and cautious, but more suspicious too. I felt like his manipulations were more subtle than ever. I felt like he was now playing the long game with his manipulations. The mom had daily breakdowns. She began to disassociate often and was noticeably a different person. The dad appeared fine, stoic almost. Yet he sometimes never left his office. He would lock himself in there for full days at a time. And the siblings. The poor siblings. They were more quiet than ever. Like I said, the family has never been this bad. I won't list everything, but trust me when I say I did everything I could for them. Made referrals for trauma therapist for the siblings. I looked into residential schools for Chris. I fought Child Protective Services on their decision. I even took on the role of a family support specialist, because all of the others stopped working with them. Something my supervisor directly told me not to do. Things were grim. I started to lose hope. But then I made a breakthrough. Chris started to open back up to me and started to vent about his feelings and worries of being alone. I took the opportunity to teach him something that may have saved the family. After the years of working with him, I knew that I couldn't teach Chris to feel empathy, but I might be able to teach him to emulate it as long as he learned that being empathetic was actually in his own best interest. It took a while, but it worked. He improved relationships with his whole family. His siblings, still traumatized, but started to feel more comfortable. He even made 2 new friends. He finally learned that all these behaviors were only hurting him, and despite not being able to fully empathize, acting that way worked out for him. I'm not sure what happiness actually feels like to Chris, but it looked like he started experiencing something that really resembled happiness. And finally, he stopped being creepy to me after every session. Things were going up, and the nightmares stopped for me too. A few months later the family ended up moving to an even nicer house. This house was out of my coverage area, yet I worked for the duration of my insurance authorization to help with the transition. The transition went well and Chris was even able to attend summer camps, something the family never felt comfortable with. Unfortunately I never got a traditional farewell session due to insurance complications. Despite that I felt comfortable leaving on the positive note that I did. I haven't seen or heard from the family for a number of years. But definitely remembered them. The case always stuck out with me. But recently something changed. I got a text message from the mom out of the blue. All it said was "we need help." I started to type a response trying to help them reach out for the appropriate services in their area. I could get into a lot of trouble if I directly worked with them without authorization, but I still cared. Before I finished, she typed back immediately, "Please, I beg you, please come over right now. We need help." It was clear I needed to call them. They most likely would need to call 911 for whatever was going on. Yet when I called, the phone went straight to voicemail. I consulted with my supervisor and she agreed I should call 911. I did, and the police went over quickly due to the family's history. Hours later, the police called me and asked if I could come over to the house. Normally I wasn't allowed to do this, but I got special permission given that the police were asking for my assistance. I drove for quite a while and I was dreading the worst. Yet I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The police escorted me into the house and I was shocked. The house was empty. Nothing was destroyed, no damage, nothing thrown around, just missing basically everything. Yet it was clear that they were just home. Food was sitting on the dinner table and just recently went cold. It looked like they somehow stopped whatever they were doing and just loaded every important piece of belonging and left. How they did this in the hours they had was unbelievable. A month has gone by and the police have been searching for them without luck. They have contacted me multiple times to ask if I heard word, but I haven't. No one knows what happened to them. I have stopped hearing from the police or anyone really by now, but I still wonder what happened. I might never know what actually happened, but I'll certainly never forget this. I don't take this word lightly, but Chris was, and is, a true sociopath. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or monsters, and I don't need to. People like Chris walk among us and most of the time we never even know about it.